to see people here. I see a lot of experienced plant people, so I'm happy to share the floor when we get to the question and answer period. So I'm going to share my screen. Looks like a bunch of people are still coming in. Should I wait a sec?
Yeah, I'm hearing all these ding dong here. No, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Let's see. No. And here we go. Okay, is everybody seeing my first slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about how protecting natural ecosystems and actually expanding them by planting native plants and trees can support the many species that are declining in numbers, and at the same time help reduce climate change by increasing carbon sequestration in soil and plants. And some of the same measures that help increase our resilience to climate change also can help prevent biodiversity loss. Oops. Here we go. So I'm going to start by talking about the biodiversity crisis. I think in general, people know less about that than the climate crisis. In June of 2021, the UN released a joint report between two groups of scientists, the scientists who've been researching and releasing reports on climate change and the scientists who've been researching biodiversity loss. And the report said that the biodiversity crisis is as dire as the climate crisis, and they both need to be addressed at once, or we risk making both of them worse. And so I'm going to explain that. I'm going to talk about the interdependent relationships among certain species. I'm definitely focusing on land-based species. My main focus will be on native plants and insects, but I'm going to talk a little about birds and also fungi, so we get some of the underground story, and how crucial these relationships are for maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And I'm going to talk about the role of natural ecosystems, both in biodiversity protection, but also in sequestering carbon. And again, a lot of the same factors that support biodiversity also increase carbon sequestration in plants and soil and add to our resistance to climate change. And then in my last section, I'm going to talk about ways to take action to support biodiversity and mitigate climate change, both at the policy level and also things people can do as private homeowners or as community members. So I'm starting with the biodiversity crisis. This is a picture of Mars, the aim of this talk, and I think for a lot of the people in this group, is to not have Earth end up looking like this. So Christiana Palmer of the UN said, "I tend to refer to biodiversity loss as a silent killer because the impact is not as visible as climate change, but in many respects, it's a lot more dangerous." And on the left, we can see one of the ways we're contributing to climate change by cutting down forests. So by doing that, we're emitting carbon rather than sequestering it. And we're also taking away habitat that many species depend on. And on the right, this is a picture of an old growth forest in Western Massachusetts, which is really diverse, storing lots of carbon and supporting many species. On the left is a graph of showing the rising number of endangered species. This does not include plants. So there are 1 million animal and plant species that are threatened with extinction, many within decades. And the declines in biodiversity can lead to ecosystem collapse, which would, be catastrophic for our food and water systems. But I'm going to talk about things we can do to reverse this trend. I mean, we're definitely losing species, but we can slow this down and save many of them if we take the right action. On the left is a graph showing different species of insects and the rate of their decline. The average of that is 41% of insects are in decline, 41 species of insect species are in decline, and many are at risk of extinction. There was actually a 27-year study in Germany that showed that Germany has lost 76% of their massive insects over that, a little more than a quarter of a century. So insects are declining 8 times faster than other species like mammals and amphibians and birds. Insect losses are 2.5% a year. And if we continue at that rate, insects could be gone by the end of the century. So to bring it closer to home, there's over 400 native bee species in Massachusetts. Many are in decline. And this is a great northern bumblebee, which is one of the ones that's at risk. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Dr. Rob Gajir, who's been doing a lot of research on endangered bees. And we know many of the plants that this bee needs for its survival. So this is one example of if we plant the right plants, we can help restore the bee population. So this is a leafcutter bee carrying a little piece of leaf to line its nest, possibly in a hollow tree. If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And E.O. Wilson said this. He's a renowned naturalist who died really, I guess it's about 2 weeks ago now, pretty recent, maybe a little more than that, but very recently. So this shows the rate of the loss of birds in North America in the past 50 years. We've lost 2.9 billion birds. And there were about 10 billion birds 50 years ago, and now we're just under 7 billion, or just over 7 billion. And a major contributor to the loss of birds is the loss of insects, because many birds depend on insects either for food for the adults or food for the young. And there are bat and reptile and amphibian and other species that are in decline that also depend on insects to some extent for food. This is a red newt from Western Massachusetts, and part of its diet is insects. So here's an adult bird bringing an insect to feed its young. Insects are fundamental for the healthy functioning of all ecosystems. They pollinate many food crops all around the world. They pollinate 90% of flowering plants, so plants are depending on them for their reproduction. They're essential food for many species, as I was saying, but also for the species that eat the species that eat insects. So they're kind of, the hub of the food web in many ways. They're insects that help decompose anything that dies, plants or animals. And they're also insects that live in soil and help break things down and aid in carbon sequestration in soil. So if we lose insects, the climate crisis also gets worse. The causes of insect decline are varied, and they vary in amount around the world, but it's generally accepted that habitat loss is a major contributor. Some of this is due to agriculture, the conventional way that we do agriculture. You can see this huge field that's, in our country, many fields are drenched with pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers, which either kill the insects or they kill plants that insects need for survival. There's other ways to do agriculture that are much healthier than that, like regenerative agriculture. I'm not going to go into that, but that's much better for the general ecosystem. Deforestation is another cause, as I showed in one of those first pictures. Cut down trees, no habitat for insects. And urbanization, there's a picture down here, if things are paved and filled in with buildings and there's no room for anything to grow, then insects have no shelter or food sources. And then, as I said, pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers are deadly for insects. Here's a picture on the lower left of an invasive plant. Invasive plants and insects destroy native habitat that native insects need for survival. And then climate change is a contributor. I mean, you can imagine huge floods, fires, that's destroying habitat and killing insects. It actually has a bigger impact in the tropics than in temperate regions. So in this section, I'm going to talk about the interdependent relationships, the mutually beneficial relationships among native plants, insects, and to some extent birds. On the right is a spice bush butterfly, and on the left is its caterpillar, which can only eat spice bush leaves. So I'm going to talk a little later about some of these very specialized relationships. So the butterfly will only lay eggs on spice bushes, since that's the only viable food source for its offspring. So I'm going to define native, non-native, and invasive plants just to help understand these ecological relationships a little better. Here's a bumblebee on blueberry flowers. So it's both feeding and pollinating the flowers. And the result of that is blueberries. And we lose the bees. Blueberries are one of the things that will disappear. So native plants co-evolved with other local species in particular ecoregions. So in the United States, that's generally accepted to mean that native plants are the plants that were here before Europeans came and brought other plants with them. But the ecoregion is important too, because different plants and insects evolve together under specific climate and geological conditions. So for instance, California is politically the same region as the United States, but ecologically it's not. So plants that grow there won't be considered native in New England. And there's, as I think many of you who are here know, there's some controversy over what constitutes a native plant. Some people say plant anything, from east of the Mississippi. Other people want to do it by state. Other people want to do it by ecoregion or even by county. So Doug Tallamy says, it's native if the species have mutually beneficial relationships. He's more interested in function than location. But anyway, that's an ongoing discussion. Non-native plants or exotic or imported plants were brought here from other regions, definitely other continents, but also other ecoregions on our continent. And in general, they offer greatly reduced or even no support for local species. And this is true even for plants that were brought here hundreds of years ago. And I'll show some more information about that. Invasive plants are non-native plants that grow very aggressively. I showed you a picture of one, and they crowd out native plants. Some of them actually exude poisonous chemicals underground that poison the roots and other life forms in the soil. And that's part of the way that they spread, is by actively killing the plants that are around them. So in general, most native plants provide much greater ecological benefits than imported or hybridized plants. And I'll talk about the hybridized plants in a little bit. So insects and plants have been co-evolving for 125 million years, evolving mutually beneficial relationships. Plants depend on insects to pollinate them in order to reproduce. So plants need to attract insects. Insects depend on plants for food, both for adults and offspring. And then in return, plants need to defend themselves against excessive feeding by insects. And they do that in a number of ways, but one of the main ways is by producing chemicals that are toxic to most insects. And interestingly, many of these chemicals are helpful medicines for us. And in return, insects have evolved enzymes that allow them to bypass the plant toxicity, but only for very specific plants. There's some small minority of insects that can feed off of many plants and even feed their offspring off of a variety of plants. But 90% of insects require very particular plants for food or to feed their offspring. And without those plants, they can't survive. And then matching that, most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. So again, they've evolved to have these kind of limited, mutually beneficial relationships. And I'm going to show some examples of how these traits match up. So this coevolution took eons. And I've had people say to me, well, why can't insects feed off of plants that have been here for 400 years? And it's kind of like saying, why can't humans eat wood? It's just that aspect of evolution is very complex and it takes a really long time. So again, most imported plants and most hybridized plants haven't evolved with these specific relationships with our native insects, and so they can't provide the same benefits. So here's an example of a specialized chemical relationship between monarch butterflies and milkweed. So on the left is a milkweed plant. That little white ball is a monarch butterfly egg. And on the right, you can see a monarch caterpillar on a milkweed plant. And that's the only plant that monarch caterpillars can eat. The butterfly actually can get nectar from a variety of plants, but if there's no milkweed available, there's nothing for the next generation of monarch butterflies. And something that I find amazing is that if a monarch caterpillar senses a high level of toxicity in a leaf, it'll bite the vein and let some of the sap drain out before it eats it, which is really intelligent. So here's another specialized relationship. This is has to do with the physical compatibility of the shapes of insects and flowers. So here's two versions of Monarda or bee balm plants. They have long, thin tubular flowers, and so they can only be pollinated by either long-tongued bees, long-tongued moths, or in this case, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are the only bird in North America that's a pollinator, but it has that long, thin beak that can get into that flower. And on the left is a hummingbird moth, which is an incredible insect to watch. So again, this is a specialized physical relationship between the shape of the flower and the shape of the insect. There's other examples like flowers that are really thick and closed up and only bumblebees can force their way in because they're the only insect that's strong enough to get in there. So there's many examples. So here I'm going to talk about hybridized plants. And here's one of these controversial plants. This is an echinacea plant, which is not native to New England. It does provide a lot of benefits to insects here, but there are some people who would rather not plant it because it didn't come from here. But here's an echinacea plant with a lot of different kinds of butterflies on it on the left. On the right is a goldfinch feeding off of echinacea seeds in the fall. So in general, native plant species provide support to local insects by providing nectar for adult insects, pollen or leaves to feed the offspring, seed for birds, and then also genetic variability because these plants are being cross-pollinated, so there's genetic variation. And if there were some adverse impact like flooding or heat or drought, there might be some plant that has mutated and can live through those conditions and go on and reproduce. So this genetic variability is really important for dealing with the changing environment that we're in. So in contrast, on the bottom, these are highly hybridized echinacea plants. And these plants have no pollen, they have no nectar, they have no seeds, and they have no genetic variation because these hybridized plants generally are cloned. So here's an example. It's decorative. Somebody might want it in their garden because they like how it looks, but it's really just decoration. It's not providing any ecosystem support. I do want to say there's some hybridized plants that retain ecological value. In particular, I've been hearing that plants that have just been made smaller generally retain ecological value, but there's a lot of research going on about this. If you're not sure you're getting a hybrid that's beneficial and you want to support insects, it's really safest to get the straight species. So here we are. I'm going to talk about trees a little bit. Trees are really important. I'll talk about them a little more later. Native oak trees support over 500 species of insects, birds, and mammals. And in general, native plants support 13 times more insect species than non-native. There's wide variation, so that's an average. And then compared to oaks, ginkgo trees are native to China. I'm sure in China they support many native species. In the US, they only support one. They're widely planted as street trees. I think people think their leaves are really pretty. I think they're pretty tough and resilient, but they're really not providing the ecosystem support that we would get if we were planting a native tree instead. And on average, non-native plants support 0 to 5 insect species. So Jean actually showed me this chart, which is incredibly helpful. Doug Tallamy is a renowned, at least in this field, entomologist who's done a lot of groundbreaking research on these specialized relationships between native plants and insects. And so this chart shows the statistics about 5 different non-native plants that grow here. So if you look on the left, there's a grass, which is actually invasive here, a tree, a cactus, a vine, and another tree. If you look in the column to the right of that, it tells you how many species are supported by each of these plants in their native area where they originated. So that ranges from 400 to 40 species that each of these plants can support in their home range. And then in the next column, you see how many species they support in North America, which is 0 to 8, much less or nothing. And then on the far right, you see how many years these plants have been here, from 100 to over 300. So again, this is demonstrating that that kind of evolution of plants being transported to totally different ecosystems, the insects don't evolve quickly enough to take advantage of them and be able to make use of them in general. Most can't. So just some other principles about attracting insects to the garden, that it's more important to have a diversity of insects than quantity if you're wanting to reverse this decline in biodiversity that we're seeing. So your garden may be buzzing with insects, but if all you have are honeybees, which are not native, and actually they compete with native bees for resources, or if you have the most common kind of bumblebees, and there's some that are actually increasing in number, then the garden isn't supporting the diversity of life that we need to be supporting now, because there's so much at risk. So the garden should have a wide variety of native insects. It should have some of the at-risk insect species. And to do that, you need to plant a lot of different kinds of flowers that bloom from spring all the way through fall, a variety of flower shapes and colors because of all these specialized relationships. And in particular, the specific plants that are needed by endangered species. And at the end, I have a resource slide, and there's a link to a chart that shows, so Rob Gajir has been doing this research on plants needed by bees and butterflies, by the ones that are at risk. So there's a chart with a lot of information about that, including growing conditions. But I want to say what I don't have in here is that trees are really, really important too. You saw how many species oaks can support. So flowers are really important. Trees and shrubs are really important too. And so you might ask, how many native plants do we need to support biodiversity? So Desiree Narango is a student of Doug Tallamy, or she was, and she did some really interesting research showing that chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of baby chickadees. And in her research, they found that if there weren't enough native woody plants in the area, then there wasn't enough food for the nestlings. So here's a chickadee with a caterpillar in its beak, because caterpillars are really good at, food for baby birds. What she found is that in an area where there was 94 to 100% native trees, so we're talking about woody plants in this study, and I'm also talking about biomass, not numbers. So if you can kind of visualize the volume of leaves on a tree compared to like the volume of leaves on a flowering perennial, we're talking about the volume, not the number of plants. So 94 to 100% woody native plants, the birds all did really well. Between 70 and 94%, they did okay, but not as well. When the number of woody plant biomass, when the amount dropped below 70%, there was not enough food to feed the birds, and the babies starved, basically. So I'm trying to think about how to say this clearly. It seems from her research that to support biodiversity, you need to plant and to have 70% native trees in an area. Now, native herbaceous plants are really important too. The amount that we need of those is less clear, but I'm going to talk a little later about some recommendations people are making about how much of those we should have. Oops, missed a slide. Okay, so this is a little bit of a summary of what I've just been talking about. Diverse plantings of native plants, including all these plants here, trees, vines, grasses, shrubs, perennials, ground covers, including in cities, are really the foundation of having a healthy ecosystem. You need a wide variety of plants in order to support the threatened and bird insect species, and also the species that depend on them. Having this variety available lessens the risk of mass extinctions. And I'll show you in a couple minutes how this builds resilience against climate change and also aids in carbon sequestration. So now I'm going to talk about how natural systems are really important for restoring biodiversity and also sequestering carbon, either protecting systems or expanding them with what we plant. So here's a cross section of what's going on underground, which usually we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's under our feet. The roadmap to net zero carbon emissions that the state of Massachusetts released about a year ago talked about how we need to radically reduce our use of fossil fuels, but even doing that won't be enough to slow down climate change enough, that we also need to sequester a great amount of carbon. And one of the main ways to do that is in natural ecosystems. So wetlands are important for that, forests are important for that, and grasslands help with that too. There's been research showing that many diverse ecosystems of native plants sequester great amounts of carbon. And I'm going to talk about the role of mycorrhizal fungi underground with that, and then again, the benefits of having diverse ecosystems. So on the left, you can see mushrooms, and those are the fruiting bodies of mycorrhizal fungi. So on the right, there's some plant roots there, but a lot of what you're seeing is an underground network of mycorrhiza, which is kind of the root system underneath mushrooms. And 95% of plant species form mutually beneficial relationships with mycorrhiza. So this is kind of the, as I was talking about with insects and plants, they've evolved these mutually beneficial relationships that help each other survive. Fungi have done the same thing underground with plants. And there are many kinds of mycorrhiza, and many of them perform very different functions. So they connect to plant roots, plants and trees. They can transfer and store carbon, both in plants and soil, and they're really important for doing that. They can extract minerals from rocks, and they transfer water and nutrients, both to plants and between plants. So I heard one research study that showed there was, a top of a hill that was really dry and the bottom of the hill was moist, and the fungi, the mycorrhiza underground, were transferring water up the hill to the plants that needed it. I've also heard about research where when a mature tree is dying in a forest, it can transfer 40% of the carbon that it has stored in its tissues to surrounding trees. So if we see a tree is dying and we cut it down, we're actually emitting a lot more carbon than if we let it go through this natural process where the tree, through the function of the fungi, is transferring carbon to other trees. So the fungi also support beneficial bacteria, which provide also many helpful functions. They can protect host plants from pathogens. And in return, they're depending on plants for nutrients because the plants can photosynthesize, but the fungi can't. So I think of this as a kind of amazing communication, transportation, and healthcare delivery system. It's just amazing all the things that are going on among these different life forms underground. So fungi can also help plants adapt to climate change. And the way this works is that the fungi reproduce and evolve really quickly. If you've walked outside after a rain in a natural area and seen mushrooms popping up, those are the fungi reproducing. So it happens really quickly. So they can evolve really quickly because they have so many generations. And they're evolving to support their partner plants because they have these mutually dependent relationships. So because the fungi can adapt quickly to changing conditions, and because they're supporting the other plants around them, they can help other plants and trees adapt. So they can increase resilience to climate change. So I'm not going to talk about soil, but this is another aspect of why soil health is so important. There's so much going on underground that's beneficial for what we see going on above ground. So to summarize a little bit, I've talked about, the diversity of insects and plants and how important those relationships are, the diversity of mycorrhizal fungi and how important they are to supporting ecosystems. So, and there's a lot of research showing that in highly diverse habitats, there's more carbon sequestration, more species are being supported, resilience is increased, adaptation is increased. As I said, carbon sequestration is increased. And these benefits occur in really any native habitat you can think of. And forests in particular can sequester carbon for centuries. The older the forest, the more carbon is stored. So in this section, I'm going to talk about action that we can take to support biodiversity and at the same time be helping to mitigate climate change. This is a picture from September in Dennehy Park in Cambridge, and these are Cambridge residents who are helping to plant a Miyawaki forest, which was sponsored by Biodiversity for Climate, which is a local group. And they're planting this very dense native little ecosystem of trees and shrubs, which are going to support each other. It's the same, it's exactly the kind of diverse ecosystem I was just talking about. So it's going to be exciting to see that grow in Cambridge. So there are a lot of opportunities for increasing native habitat. I've heard people say, well, I'm in Cambridge, it's a city, it can happen outside. We don't need to do anything. You can't do it in cities. And that's actually not true. There's not enough wild habitat left to support and restore biodiversity. There are 40 million acres in lawn in the US, and that equals to the number of acres in the continental national parks. In Massachusetts, 20% of land is in lawn, which is over 1 million acres. And lawns are basically ecosystem deserts. If you look on the left, it's a monoculture, it doesn't have diversity. It has short roots, so if it's storing any carbon, it's not much. A lot of people use all kinds of chemicals on their lawns, which is going to kill any other kind of life and also pollute waterways. So lawns are really not helping. Maybe better than bare soil if you're not using chemicals, but that's about it. So on the right, you can see a mostly native garden. It's a sidewalk strip planted along a street with a lot of variety of plants. It's filtering water, it's supporting insects, it's supporting birds, and it's beautiful. So there's, even really small parcels can do a lot. There's a lot of potential habitat in cities and in suburban areas. So here's an example. Doug Tallamy, who I mentioned, is advocating that we plant half our lawns with native habitat. And so this is a picture of a house in suburban area near Boston, where her lawn, the homeowner's lawn, used to look like this one on the left. And now she just recently planted a pretty large area of it with native trees, shrubs, grasses, and flowering plants. So she's going to be supporting a lot of wildlife, and she still has some lawn to use for other purposes. So, this may be too much for a lot of people to do, but really anywhere you start, just adding any native plants or one native tree, anytime you have an open space, put in native plants. You can start little and build. So here's some opportunities across the US to put in native habitat, almost 600 million acres. So this chart on the left is from satellite imagery, and these are all these opportunities of areas where it's either turf or just soil that's been cleared. And here's an example on the right. On the upper picture is a power line that's been clear cut. And so underneath it, there's just hardly anything that can support wildlife, and all that bare soil is emitting carbon. And then the lower picture, they have to keep trees out so they don't grow into the wires, but there's many other kinds of native plants growing in there. This is being monitored by students at the University of Pennsylvania. And this area is full of insects, birds, amphibians, little mammals. I mean, it's really attracting and supporting a lot of wildlife. So there's a lot of opportunity in our country for planting biodiverse, supportive, healthy native habitat. So here's some lost opportunities of policy decisions that were made or drawn up with just focusing on climate change and not thinking about biodiversity. So when this roadmap to
Did you ask Dad to come here?
Hi, could you please mute?
Oh,
Thanks. So Massachusetts is, they haven't released it, but they've written up a Healthy Soils Action Plan that's supposed to be part of the roadmap to zero carbon emissions by 2050. And again, I did talk about how healthy soils are really important. There's a lot of really good things in this report, including how to protect soil during construction, under a lot of different conditions. But again, they were only thinking about sequestering carbon in soil, not thinking about supporting biodiversity. So there's no advocating for planting native plants when they talk about planting, it's just planting. So that's a lost opportunity. And then the City of Cambridge Urban Master Forest Plan, a lot of work went into this. And again, the city wants to plant trees to cool the city and store carbon, which is really important and necessary. But they use 20-year-old research saying it doesn't matter if you use native trees or not. So that's very out of date. And I'm hoping we can update it, because if we could be prioritizing native trees and planting them in any place where they can grow, and there's lots of different trees for lots of different conditions, then we can also be supporting biodiversity. And then there's the controversy of clearing forests to site solar fields. And given what I've been talking about, I just think that's a huge, dangerous mistake to make. We have many opportunities to put in solar fields, which we need, but be protecting forests at the same time. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail. These are different ordinances and laws around in different places around the country that are supporting biodiversity and native plants. So New Jersey's asking to only use native plants to landscape their roadways. Somerville passed an ordinance with minimum requirements for native plants on public land. Their Urban Master Forest Plan also prioritizes natives. So Cambridge has a lot to learn from Somerville. There's a bill in Congress, which is still in committee, which is very comprehensive support of protecting biodiversity. And then there's legislation in Massachusetts on limiting pesticide use and protecting forests. But from what I'm observing from being in sort of the native plant world and now on a climate research organization, the two groups don't talk to each other enough. We need to share more information so that when people are making decisions to intervene in or use nature to affect climate conditions, those policies also need to be formed by an understanding of ecology and supporting biodiversity. So I guess I got ahead of myself. That's part of what this slide is about, that people should be consulting with ecologists when they're making policy that affects nature and enacting policy at all these different levels to protect native habitat, avoid all these chemical uses, plant diverse native plantings, plant a minimum, have minimum standards for at least 70% woody plants and maybe 50% non-woody native plants, just to have something to aim for. I want to say these numbers are part of ongoing research, so these recommendations might change. and probably differ among different researchers, but it's sort of a ballpark. And then also removing invasive plants is really important. And again, planting small parcels in gardens, including in cities, adds up to large benefits. So here's what individuals and communities can do for biodiversity. A lot of it is the same as what I was just talking about, but I'm going to add a little bit. If people want to shrink their lawn, you could think about what do you need for recreation and walking paths. And then the rest of it, you can gradually replant with natives. There are also healthier ways to maintain lawns, which I won't go into in detail, but mowing less often, leaving the grass longer, allowing some flowering plants in, definitely avoiding any chemical use. And again, planting for a variety of native plants from spring through fall. This is the link to the chart that I talked about that tells you which plants support the endangered insects in Massachusetts. And there's a lot of growing conditions included in that to help people decide which ones they might be able to use. And then skipping fall cleanup is really important. I wanted to say, I didn't do this earlier, but trees are, really beneficial food for caterpillars when the leaves are green, but the leaves are just as important when they've fallen on the ground, that there are a lot of insects that overwinter in the leaves. They also overwinter in plant stems. So it's much better to wait and not clean up until late spring at the earliest. And the fallen leaves also are fertilizing the ground, they're mulch, they slow down how fast water filters in. So when we have these huge rainfalls, they can help reduce flooding. So leaving the leaves is really important. Night lights also are dangerous to insects. So changing to yellow bulbs, putting them on motion sensors, or just leaving them off is helpful. And then just to say, it's really exciting seeing what comes to your garden when you have native plants. I can spend hours watching them. I'm interested in identifying the different bumblebees that show up and seeing the birds. It's just very thrilling. And then you can post signs to let your neighbors know what's going on in your garden, either so they don't wonder why it looks messier than if you take everything out, but also they understand that there's beneficial things we can be doing for our local ecosystems. So I'm not going to go through my summary. I want to leave time for questions and answers, but we're going to make these resource slides available either in the chat or you'll have access to this whole talk. And I can also just provide a slide deck if there's certain slides you want to see. So these are lots of resources about native plants, and here's some of the references that I used. So that is where I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Amy. That's great. Do people have we put any questions into the chat, or do people want to ask questions now?
Jean, this is Brucey speaking. Yes, we've had some questions already, so we might like to begin with some of those. And hold on, I just got something covering my screen as I was about to read the questions. Here we go. So Roberta Kovner had two questions. First, she said she has a huge Norway maple that is being cut down this week. And she asked, should I not have the stump ground? Does anybody want to answer that?
Does anyone else want to answer? I have a thought, but I don't know if I have the most expert thought with all these experienced people who are here.
Well, I will answer it because I had a silver maple taken down a few years ago, and I did leave the stump. And I had the most amazing, should I call it, blooming of various mushrooms for a number of years, species I'd never seen before, and sometimes in great profusions along what must have been the course of the roots. So if you're in a position to leave the stump, that's well worth doing. If you want to hasten its demise, you can drill holes across the top of it in a random pattern, and that will cause it to break down faster.
My thought was, even though Norway maples are invasive and I'd rather they weren't here, they are here and they do store carbon. So I'm assuming whatever doesn't get ground is maintaining the carbon and it'll decompose into the ground. And it does sound like if mushrooms are popping up, it's doing some good.
Yeah. Roberta's other question was, what about wood chip mulch to promote or deter soil health?
Oh boy, that's a good one.
I think that's controversial. And again, I'm wondering, are there other people here who feel like they confident about answering that?
I don't have experience.
Janet, would you like to take a crack at that? I know you focus on soil health.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm a complete expert either on this, but the few things that I remember 30 years ago, people were saying, oh, don't use wood chips, they rob nitrogen from the soil. And now I think people generally say wood chips can be beneficial because they promote a more fungal balance to your soil as opposed to a more bacterial balance to the microorganisms. So that's some of the things that I've read. I always think as much like Amy's saying, biodiversity, I think diversity in our mulches is also a good thing. So that's where I land. And as far as grinding the stump, I think the slower you can release that carbon, the better. So if you can, leave it.
Yeah, Mike, I guess I'm wondering what other people think of this. My concern about wood chips, I'm wondering if it depends on where it is, like in an herbaceous perennial garden. You know, what about leaving room for the minor bees that go into the soil, or for the leaves to fall down and just naturally recycle? It seems like it's introducing something that wouldn't have been there, at least in that kind of sunny garden that's not underneath trees. But that's more of a question than an answer.
Yeah,
I'd like to comment on that if I could. First, yeah, the ground nesting bees, 70% of them, of our native bees are ground nesting. And I've learned recently that if you basically create a sandbox, 4x8, half soil, half sand, that's a good habitat for ground nesting bees. I'd say about, the wood chips, it's a great way to transform from lawn to wildlife habitat. And eventually, sure, you can have, those bare patches are good for ground nesting bees, but the big question, I think, in most people's minds is, how in the world do I get rid of that lawn? And sheet mulching is a great way to do it. And of course, sheet mulching uses either wood chips or leaves or something on the top as a mulch layer. Eventually, those wood chips will decompose, and if you get the plant growth really crowding out the weeds, you won't need any more mulch.
Great, thanks. Are there other questions?
I thought the point you made about the fungi sending water uphill is really fascinating, because I've just been reading this book about plant communities in Prospect Hill Park in Waltham, and the whole notion of gravity is influencing where, everything runs downhill. So the plants that can survive on less nutrition and less moisture uphill tend to thrive up there, and the ones that thrive in a dense whatever. But I didn't realize how much the fungi could help out those guys up on the hill. That's a new point. The whole fungal part, I need to know more about. So thank you.
Fascinating. So Suzanne Simard is the researcher who's been doing the most about that. Her book, Finding the Mother Tree, is really fascinating about those fungal tree relationships.
She does good TED Talks too.
Mhm.
Yeah. There are a lot of, Russ, you posted some really good links in here. And you mentioned one thing about how to get farmers or agricultural people to focus on biodiversity. How do you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, so, well, the Wild Farm Alliance is a group that their point is you might be the state organic association blue ribbon prize winning broccoli grower, but unless you've got diverse assemblages of native plants along the edges of your field and you're creating space for wildlife to make a corridor to cross safely from one area of habitat to another, you're not really doing what you need to do.
Mhm.
So they go into a lot more examples of how farms can coexist with biodiversity on that website, that organization.
Great. Good point.
Yeah, I stayed with a farmer in Ohio a few years ago, and he was poisoning everything around the edge of his fields with Roundup. It was like he just wanted, there used to be milkweed growing there and lots of other things. And I think that's just sort of the new aesthetic, but yeah, needs to be changed. So Eileen has her hand up. Eileen, do you have you need to unmute. Eileen, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Can't hear me? Can you hear?
Yes, yes. We
Okay.
can hear you.
I have a small lawn and I've been planting lots of clover in it. And I wonder if clover can redeem a lawn.
Clover's really helpful. Another place where you can look for things you can put in your lawn that would be helpful are the link. I'm gonna have to take a minute and put this back in the chat. But the link to Pollinate Northampton's spreadsheets on plants that support at-risk insects in different growing conditions. So they have plants for sun, plants for shade, plants for sidewalk strips, and they have plants for lawns. So if I'll put that link in the chat, but also feel free to get in touch with me. I could put my email on the chat too. And you can get a list of plants for that situation.
We also have a question from Linda Relson. Does Mr. Charles Pollinator Pathways Group have any plans to lead invasive species removal events in 2022? Or are other organizations like DCR coordinating such events locally? And one answer is yes. Here in Arlington, a group called Arlington, the acronym is ARMI. They're working on invasive removal.
Well, Linda, where do you live?
Uh-huh.
I live in Watertown.
In Watertown. Because I'd say a few of us have done guerrilla activities out there and removing invasives. And if there's a certain area, I mean, in the summer I teach kids in Cambridge, and we try to get every black swallowwort on every fence post we could see, and it was just daunting and impossible. And at the end of the summer, they said, no more black swallowwort. So that was the Pod Patrol there. But I think, I don't know what Watertown is doing. I don't know. Do you know Pam? I don't think she's here tonight. Pam Phillips may know. I know that the Waltham Land Trust goes along the Charles River, and that leads into Watertown. But tends to be different groups. Sustainable Belmont has a group that's picking up garbage and doing some invasives along the way. We could start a little chat line or something that says, who wants to go out on such and such a day to go hack at certain things? So I don't know.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, it's so quiet. Oh, are you raising your hand, Roberta? Okay, you have to unmute.
Roberta, you're muted.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's that? What
Good.
about water features? My impression was last summer that the heat, I saw so few birds. I saw so few anything, but it was it last summer or the summer before, there was so much heat. And I just thought if I had a pond or something for the birds, or I thought this could help. I don't know whether whether insects need water, but it just seemed so dry and not perhaps this summer. Maybe it was last summer. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the one before. You're absolutely right. And that actually should be on my what you can do list. A pond, or even if you're in a city, some saucer that will hold water that you make sure you replenish every few days because you don't want mosquitoes breeding in it. But yeah, insects, and also if you have little rocks, insects need to be able to stand on something to drink. So for insects and birds, any kind of fresh water is really important.
And maybe I can piggyback on that question, which is, so I had a pollinator garden planted. I did some of the work, but I certainly didn't do much of the planning. And I have a tremendous number of bees in that particular garden. It's not in Lexington, where I saw very few bees. Agastache, Monarda, I mean, it's just incredible number of bees. I don't know whether they're the right kind of bees. I don't know whether they are deterring birds, because I didn't see as many birds. And that may just be the population of birds declining. I don't know whether this is completely helpful to have such a successful bee population. Does anybody know?
I don't think that would deter birds. I mean, we used to have so many more insects everywhere, and birds, anyway, I'm happy for other people to speak up too, but it just sounds healthy. We're dealing with a lot of climate impacts. So, the bird population's declining a lot too.
Trees are so critical for birds. And there's a professor at Lesley who did a study, David Morimoto, over 7 years, looking at the bird distribution in Cambridge alone, and found that sections of the town that were near, tree deserts like East Cambridge or Central Cambridge had, sparrows, pigeons, but not a lot of the songbirds and wild birds compared with Fresh Pond or Alewife Reservation. So it was a telling study. So you need the right tree, of course, to support the caterpillars that are going to be the food for the birds, but you also need the overstory and all the other benefits that trees provide. It may be that some of the birds are just focusing where they need the shelter and the congregating in those areas, and of course the food source.
The other thing about bees that you were mentioning, I think some of us who've been trying to garden for pollinators are now realizing that we need to learn about the bees and figure out which bees we have. And do we have mostly Bombus impatiens, which is the common bumblebee, or do we have any of the more endangered bumblebees? And so I've had some success with the Beecology website, trying to upload the videos of my bees and figure out what bees I have. I'm still not sure I've actually had any of the endangered bumblebees. But I recommend to all of us that we start looking and trying to learn what we have so that we can be more specific in our plantings.
It's a really good point.
Thank you. Yeah. So that's called the Bee Ecology website.
Yes.
I'll
And
put, I'll put, oh, somebody, Brucey put in the link.
well, and the other thing to make it a little easier, we, in the survey that we have posted for people to put their garden on the Mystic Charles map, are a list of plants that we provide as a checklist, but many of them list the number of species they support as either a host plant for a caterpillar or as a pollen supplying plant for one of the at-risk bees. So that's another place to start. And what I want to add to what Kim was saying, I talked to Dr. Jagir. He has a pollination system study site in several, but one in Sudbury, where people worked and observed different bees there. And then they did a seed swap of those plants. And people took the seeds home to their backyards because they had seen the activity. So it's still early. They planted those last year, so I don't know how big their plants were, but I think there's merit to focusing on some of those plants. Mm.
And while you're thinking about learning to identify the different bees and other pollinators that are visiting your garden, you might enjoy a short documentary that's available on PBS called My Garden of 1,000 Bees. It's made by a very experienced wildlife photographer who suddenly found himself locked down in Bristol, England by the pandemic. And he had to actually create special camera equipment to get the kind of pictures that he wanted. The result is extraordinary.
Sounds
Great.
good.
And I see we have a request to drop the survey, a link to our survey with the plants for the pollinator map.
Okay.
Is there also a link to landscapers who specialize in installing these habitat? I mean, I do know of someone, but in a different area. I don't know of in Lexington, in my area, someone who specializes in coming in, helping you plan it out. I'll do the work.
If
I'll
you go
help
to the Grow Native Massachusetts website, they have a lot of resources, and one of their pages is landscapers. But other people may have suggestions too.
Yeah, with Lexington Living Landscapes, Roberta, if you're in Lexington, it's particularly apt. We recently posted a page where we surveyed a number of landscape designers looking for those with expertise in native plants, and listed that and included a list of those who would do sort of one-time $100 consultation without any expectation of further work. So I'll post the link in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's great.
And if you want to take a course that we're teaching, some members of the Mystic Charles group are teaching at the Arlington Community Ed, a 2-part course, I think it's March 3rd and 10th. And it's helping people design their own gardens with an emphasis on the sort of what we call the superpower native plants, the keystone ones and the Jagir list. So I don't have a link to that. Brucey, do you have a link to that catalog for Arlington Community Ed?
I'm just going to go hunt for it now.
Oh, thank you. Russ, you brought up this interesting idea about invasives, the 1-for-1 swap, which is a great idea.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so Yeah, so I do that mainly on the sites I'm working with where I encounter invasives, and it's very satisfying, especially if you're talking about a site where, it isn't completely totally overrun with invasives, but you have an occasional invasive here and there, and you feel like you can really make a substantive difference just by popping it out and dropping a good plant in its place. But even on the scale of an individual yard, just to do that, it kind of primes the pump and gets you to think, okay, that wasn't hard to do that one. What else can I do? At least it gets you started. It's a very simple act to get you started and leaves you with something substantive to look at and say, okay, at least I took care of that invasive and put in a good plant in its place.
Yeah.
Russ, you're inspiring me. I'm a guerrilla gardening a little traffic island. Yeah, a couple blocks from my house. I wouldn't even call it gardening. I pulled out some ragweeds that they must have been like 3 inches in diameter and taller than me. I mean, they were phenomenal. And I planted some goldenrod that I had extras of and a few other things, but there's also a Japanese barberry on this island. And so I feel like it'll be a little tricky to dig it up. It'll be like a little obvious what I'm doing. So I need to think about what I could quickly put in its place that could survive right in the middle of this is right in the middle of a road. So any ideas I'm happy for.
Yeah, well, I probably recommend a salt tolerant species like bayberry or sweet fern. Can definitely handle conditions like that. They're plants that grow in nutrient poor soil and can make their own nitrogen, like plants in the pea family can. So they're pretty tough. Unless if you need a flowering plant, then there are other choices I'd recommend. But in terms of, plants that are, especially the sweet fern is not going to get more than 2.5 feet tall. So it's never going to block traffic. So that might be a good choice for that spot.
Those are great ideas. I love sweet fern. I love both of those. I haven't had good luck with them in my yard, but maybe I'll try them on this little traffic median.
How about Japanese knotweed replacement, Russ?
Oh, that's such a tough one because Charlie can probably speak about this more than I can because he's in an active battle with it right now. But it's knotweed is just the classic case where even when you think you're done, you're not. It requires eternal vigilance on any site you're trying to control it on. So it looks like it's finished, but it might still be kind of, smoldering underneath the surface. And if you turn your back, it could reappear. So Charlie, what else do you have to say?
Ask me again in 10 years.
Yeah.
We've just finished year 1. We had a great chat. Gene introduced us to Mike Bald from Vermont, who said the way to attack it is the 12, 11, 10, 9, etc. rule, where the first year you cut it 12 times, the second year 11, third year 10, and so forth. So that didn't scare us away. We're still going to try, but stay tuned.
And we're optimistic. I also put together a plan of once we create little holes there, what might we put in its stead? So we're going to experiment a little.
Yeah, we're very excited. It's a spot right on the Minuteman Bikeway for those of you who are bikers.
Oh, yes, I know it.
Yeah.
I've watched with great interest.
Good.
Well, one thing I've encountered is not just invasives, but sometimes natives can take over. Were you going to say something more, Charlie?
I was going to change the subject, so why don't you finish up?
Well, all I was going to say is I've made some meadows, or I've been part of projects that involve making meadows, and now we're re-diversifying them because certain plants are taking over. I have one that's all goldenrod, and another that's goldenrod and mugwort. So I'm trying to, I love goldenrod, but trying to move some of that out and bring in some other plants. All right, please take over, Charlie.
Well, I was just going to 2 other bits of news from Lexington. One's a little off topic, but in November, our town meeting overwhelmingly voted to implement a phase out of gas-powered leaf blowers. over the next 3 years. And the opponents, mainly landscapers, but a number of opponents in town have petitioned. So it's going to referendum, and the voters will vote on it on March 7th. So there's an active campaign going on. I'll put the link in the chat if any of you are interested in learning more about what we're trying to do in Lexington and whether there's any applicability in your towns. The other is a little more on point, and that's 2 weeks from tomorrow night. We're hosting an online talk by Rebecca McMacken on the topic of pollination, pollinator ecology. And she's the director of horticulture at the Brooklyn Bridge Park. Pollinator ecology is one of her specialties. She has great photography. She weaves together wonderful stories. She's a very gifted speaker. And if you're looking for an entertaining evening to learn about pollinators and to sort of forget that it's the middle of winter, I would encourage you to come. And I'll put the link to that in the chat as well.
That's great. Thank you.
I can say I've heard her speak and she's really inspiring. Everything you say is true. It's very exciting talk. Especially to see what you can do at the edge of New York City. Amazing.
Yes.
I've signed up for that. Do other people have announcements like that? It would be great to know what everyone's working on for the coming year. Talks or
I'm going to a Jumping Worms conference in a couple of weeks.
I think-
I was really depressed to find them in my garden this year. And so that's going to be an ongoing educational process.
Brucey, I thought was going to that too. Will you take notes? Because I don't want to go, but I know that I need to be part of that. Yeah. That was.
Isn't that one online also? If you can sign up for it?
Yeah.
It's a jumping worm. It's a 2-day jumping worm thing.
It's 2 mornings. Yeah.
And consecutive mornings.
Right.
But they're online, so you don't necessarily have to physically go there.
That's right. It's online.
I was going to say that what I'm in the town of Belmont, and I hooked up there's a group of us that are trying to follow your lead, Charlie, but Belmont's much farther behind in the leaf blower issue. So we have a public forum on January 25th to educate our selectmen on the urgency of addressing leaf blowers. They don't think it's an issue. So we're about 5 years behind you, but we're going to start. The other thing that our town is doing, and I hope this is happening in your towns, it's mostly for Belmont residents, but I think other people could join. We're going to meet with our state reps, and Amy's going to be part of a talk to learn about all the different levels of legislation happening for climate change, pesticides, and biodiversity. What I like about the forum is, often I'll hear there's something about municipal tree growing legislation and pesticides over there, but this is bringing it together, everything that's happening at the State House and on a local level. I don't know if other towns do a roundup like that, but that's a great way to concentrate some of the issues that we all care about. And we're
Jean,
yeah. Yes.
what are you doing about the leaf blowers? Did you say leaf blowers?
Yes, in Belmont, we're trying to get a regulation drafted where we would ultimately want to phase out gas powered leaf blowers, but the phases would be to limit the hours and the time of year that the leaf blowers could be used. And this is modeled after Somerville has a pretty good ordinance, no leaf blowing on Sundays. Well, thank you. But I think Charlie, yours is going for the complete phase out. What do we call that? Twilighting, sunlighting, something like that. By what year?
Sunsetting.
Sunsetting. Okay, by what year?
It would be March of 25 for commercial operators and March of 26 for everyone, for residents as well.
Okay.
But people could still use the battery ones. Is that
Oh,
correct?
absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
that's
Right.
But
another
you're-
battle.
So it's not getting rid, it's not teaching people to leave the leaves. It's mostly noise reduction.
Noise is a big thing, but what I've learned, and many people are, is that the emissions of these two-stroke engines are just horrendous. So it's as much a matter of air pollution as noise pollution, and a matter of environmental justice, because most of the people most at risk from the noise and pollution levels tend to be low-paid immigrant labor.
Mm. I have been advocating to, throw in the biodiversity, the life cycle of our next generation insects into why we are daring to touch leaves at all. But the committee has said, let's just focus on one thing first. So it's frustrating. I mean, Amy, we want to take your message here, which was fantastic and well researched, to the people who know very little about this, so I don't know, we want to bottle it up and just get it out there, right? To educate as many people as possible.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out how to get the message to the decision makers, the policy makers.
So I think one of the things to do is to go to your select board meetings or your city council meetings. Many of them have citizen open forum or some other way, and other ways of being heard. Develop warrant articles for town meeting or the equivalent for city council. That's part of the work that needs to be done. And then identify the state legislators who are working on related legislation and support them.
Yeah.
And when it's time for we've gotten pretty much through the season of hearings for the current round of legislation, but it's extremely important to submit written testimony as well as oral testimony during the hearing process. The current legislation session has an important deadline on February 2nd. At that point, all the bills that are currently in committee must be reported out. So there's still a chance to influence what will happen. So if you're watching a particular piece of legislation that you think is really important in this area, in this topic area, get right on it and keep pushing.
I might get in touch with you after this and just talk about how to proceed. That's helpful.
And NOFA Mass, I think Russ posted a link to the NOFA Mass policy page. They're doing a tremendous amount around the pesticide issue. They've worked on healthy soils in the past. There is also important tree legislation, several different pieces.
I see John Root is here. It's great to see you. I've seen you speak before. You're from Western Mass, are you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Are you part of a pollinator pathway group out there?
I just spoke with Brucey the other day, and I'm very excited to hear about what you're doing. And we're hoping that the Massachusetts Pollinator Network will be adopting the Mystic Charles Pollinator Pathway survey and map, on a statewide basis. And that would be great, because our group has just started out. We're calling ourselves Pollinate Amherst. But I would love to see those things in place before we do our big rollout of our media campaign, because then we can, that survey is just an excellent tool to educate people and to motivate them, and even to motivate them to motivate their neighbors, because it shows, by connecting each other, why not be generous with your plants, right? So for all those reasons.
Well,
But
that's good, because we started putting signs, these physical signs up at properties too.
right.
But you can take an armchair tour, and it shows a lot. Sarah Wong is instrumental in that creation and maintenance and monitoring. I don't know if she stepped out. I don't see if she's here.
She's right there.
Here.
Okay.
I'm right here.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, I just wanted to give you a little update. Let me see if I can find it. Because, one thing that our map has been doing is we've been trying to map the
Distances between bees.
right. And now so I actually did an acreage count of pollinator, actual pollinator pathway. So I'm just trying to find that information.
Do you want to show your screen?
Not really.
Okay. No.
I was just going to give you a couple of numbers.
Oh, thank you. Well, as you're pulling that up, John, I think it was from Evan Abramson's talk. He had put together a chart of what the different size bees can travel for distance. So
right. Exactly. The sweat bees can't travel very far at all.
Right.
Of course, the honey bees can go miles, but we're not concerned about them.
No.
Right. So sweat bees can go only up to 300 feet. So we have that on our map. And so I just did a little count of, so we're entering our second year, right? So, and Arlington has the most individual entries, 28. And they have 24.5 bee paths. That's because it crosses over into Cambridge. But Belmont and Somerville are tied for second with 20 bee paths each that have connected up to form 84 and 53 acres respectively of pollinator corridor.
We got to write this up. Yeah.
Yes, I'm reading it from my Facebook post. It's not a Facebook group.
Okay. All right. That's a great start. Let's go beyond. Yes, that's wonderful. Did you do Cambridge?
No, Cambridge didn't rank. I only did the,
I think we
the
have
top to show what is going on. So Cambridge, even though Cambridge started out hot, they have not been keeping it.
I told everyone to get your garden on the map, get your neighbor's gardens on the map, and keep talking about it. It's a great way to meet people and to do something for our pollinators and native plants.
I see a bumper sticker in our future.
Why not?
Yeah. We have, it may be February, I'm just confirming, or March. Dennis Collins from Mount Auburn Cemetery is going to speak about how certain gardens have now transitioned to native plants within Mount Auburn. They still, it's historically what is it called? A horticulture cemetery. So they still do have ornamental plants there, but he's going to talk about the native plant gardens in Mount Auburn. So I will confirm in the next day or two whether that's our February talk or our March talk. And we are open for ideas and people who want to share their expertise with our members. We're trying to complement and not duplicate what the Pollinator Network is doing. Rosemary, she's had some really great talks. We've attended those. So if anyone wants to share some ideas of talks they'd like to see or hear, please write to us at the Gmail address, I guess.
And one other note is that Rosemary Malfi, the coordinator of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network, who is a bee scientist, and I will be talking to the Arlington Garden Club on January 19th at 10:30 a.m.
Can you put a link for that out?
Oh, let me go find it.
How fun. Great. And soon we have to order plugs and plants for a new year. So in all of these resource lists, there's also a list of where to buy plants, right? I think, and if it's not on this chat, it's in our Google group. So. I don't know what else. We're very close to, yeah, the end here. I'd love to know what some projects you guys are working on or concerns. I'm launching a new business. My website comes up in about 2 weeks, Divine Native Plantings. And I have a new name for my education program, but I can't reveal that one yet. But my mission is to add more pollinator pathways in this region and have students help do it. So stay tuned for that. And any other comments?
This has been great. Thank you so much. It gives me hope. And I'll get
Bye,
out the
everybody.
word about this organization. Thank
Okay.
you.
Great. Come again.
I will.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you,
Thank
Amy.
you.
That was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Thanks to everyone. It's great
Great
to
job.
Thank you.
meet all these
Thank you,
terrific
Amy.
people.
Great to see you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you in a month.
Likewise.
And